So there's this talking point going around among Zionists who are desperate to try to justify the Gaza genocide in any which way. And like most Zionist talking points, it relies on a complete decontextualization and basically the ignorance of the audience to work at all. Here's an emblematic example of what I'm talking about here. It's been viewed 150,000 times on the X platform. Let's read the argument here from Eisenberg, a Israeli government propagandist who runs honest reporting, writes for Fathom Journal, NGO Monitor, UN Watch. Extremely normal stuff, right? You have a bunch of like Israeli government linked propaganda organizations that are entirely dedicated to like just claiming that like every single NGO lies about Israel, every single media organization lies about Israel, the UN lies about Israel. Just so normal. Anyway, so here's his claim. According to Hamas's Gaza fatality data, which includes natural deaths, adult men account for majority of fatalities, 52%. Media's go-to line that fatality are mostly women and children is now false. Don't expect the media to change the line now that it's mostly adult men. So the implication of this pretty clearly is that since the fatalities are mostly adult men, that must mean that like there's a bias towards combatants, right? That like civilians aren't being killed in a disproportionate amount. And I'd just like to note that what he said there, which includes natural deaths, that's a blatant lie. Not only do the Gaza MOH fatality statistics not include natural deaths, they actually don't include deaths from non-violent causes. Like if someone starves to death as the result of Israel's blockade, they're not included in the death count. It's only people who have died to like bombing or being shot or being hit by shrapnel or, you know, that sort of thing. Just to provide evidence of this, as this article in NPR notes, the death count does not include bodies that have not been discovered yet, as in the thousands of people who are believed to be trapped under the rubble, buried in mass graves, etc. It also does not include the untold numbers of people dying from preventable disease, malnutrition, and other consequences of the war. So these are specifically not included. So this death toll is lower, if anything, right? So he's just lying there. But that's not the reason why I wanted to respond to this. The reason why I wanted to respond to this is because the fact is that this figure here, the majority of fatalities being 52% men, is actually extremely low. The only way that you can get a gender ratio of fatalities that includes 52% adult men is genocide. There's no possible way. It indicates intentional targeting of civilians. Because in basically any war, basically any conflict, indeed any genocide, men are always killed first. The reason is that men are the main threats to the people doing the genocide. Even a male civilian is seen as a potential threat, someone who can potentially fight back. So they usually kill the men first. It's just how things are. There's also other factors as well, like men are way more likely to stay back for longer. Women and children are more likely to be evacuated first. Men are much more likely to participate in things like rescue operations, stuff like that. The main victims of war are men. And this is just a fact. I know that a lot of people, like for some feminist reason, don't like this, but it's true. And I don't know how people got any notion otherwise ever, because statistically this is just undeniable. You know, I'm not saying this from a men's rights activism standpoint. I'm saying this from a reality standpoint. This is just the facts. This is all the same tired talking points as well. Like if you want basically everything that I'm saying here, but in a more thorough and detailed way, I made a video where I covered this sort of thing more than a year ago. This one here on my main channel. Gaza death toll denial debunked. And I cover this talking point within it, but they keep rehashing the same debunked talking points over and over again. So I want to, talk about this here in a more dedicated little clip. So if you look at the statistics, for example, of deaths during the Bosnian War. The Bosnian War, which is often considered to have constituted a genocide against Bosnians, as in they intentionally killed Bosnians with the intent of getting rid of them, If we look at statistics of deaths for this war, in the overall number of war dead, 92% were men. 92%. Isn't that interesting? We had a genocide in Bosnia where 92% of the casualties were men. Now this obviously, unfortunately, does include non-Bosnians in the toll. So it's not as precise as I would like it to be, but it's still very indicative. Because even if you only include civilian dead, like if you get rid of literally all of the combatants from the war and only include the civilians who were killed, what you get is still a ridiculously lopsided ratio of men to women. 29,000 civilian men kill 8,000 civilian women. This isn't even including children, by the way, which is a whole other thing. So that means that only among the confirmed civilians killed during the Bosnian War, 78% of them were male. 78%. So how the fuck is Israel targeting combatants when, even when the combatants are included in the demographics, as they are in the Gaza MOH death toll, they still only killed 52% men? Because I'm comparing here a figure that includes combatants to one that doesn't, to one that's only civilians. And the ratio is still so much worse. When you compare it to the combatant ratio, it's 92%. It's fucking crazy, right? This is a trend that you see basically repeated over and over and over again. If you look at the casualty figures for the Syrian civil war, which do include children as well, then in March 2024, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, there had been 123,000 male civilian dead, 16,000 women civilian dead, and 26,000 children civilian dead. So the adult males there among the civilian dead are very similar to the civilian dead in the Bosnian genocide, the Bosnian War. 74% male, adult male, among the civilians only. 15% children, compared to 33% in Gaza. 9% women. So clearly, how the fuck do you get 52% male dead, including combatants, when even excluding combatants, that would be an extremely weirdly low number? The only answer to that question is targeting civilians intentionally. Because in a more regular war, where things are a lot more focused on combatant versus combatant combat, the dead are overwhelmingly male, always. Now, if you want a particularly spicy comparison here, which really brings home the point here, let's look at October 7th. The gender ratio for the October 7th Al-Aqsa flood operation. Let's take a look at that. This is the one that really brings home the ridiculousness of what these people say, because they claim that October 7th was a genocide. Let's take a look at the gender ratio. 73% male, 27% female. The vast majority of those killed were military-age males, as they like to say. Vast majority, as you can see in this age and gender breakdown here. As you can see, there were only around 30 children under the age of 18 killed. Basically a tiny smidgen of the distribution here. Like, what is that? Like 2 to 3% of the total victims? Something like that. Almost nothing compared to what they've killed in Gaza. So these people say that October 7th was genocide, yet compared to the Gaza genocide, the demographics indicate that it was actually highly targeted. Like, it involved ratios of gender, of child deaths that are highly indicative not of a genocide, but rather of a regular modern military conflict. You know what event has a demographic profile of its victims that is much closer to the Gaza genocide than that of like any actual regular armed conflict that did not specifically involve like mass genocide and mass intentional targeting of civilians on an industrial scale? The Holocaust. In the Holocaust, it's estimated there were around 1.5 million child victims and 2 million women. That leaves 2.5 million adult males for the remaining proportion if we use the 6 million figure. So that's 42% of the victims of the Holocaust were adult males. Now, 52% is a lot closer to 42% than it is to 73%, 74%, 76%, 92%, isn't it? So clearly, you can infer, literally just from the demographics, that these people are highlighting while being too stupid to realize that in doing this, they are hurting their own argument, their own genocide denial. This can only happen as a result of civilian targeting, intentional civilian targeting, intentional genocide. And it's insane that these people think, the thing is, these arguments do kind of work. Because people don't fucking know. I don't know, I guess, the average person doesn't think, wait, what does that mean, right? I need a point of comparison here to understand what this means. Because you don't know if 52% is like a so-called good or bad ratio or not, unless you compare it to other conflicts. And when you do, oh man, it looks fucking bad, doesn't it? It looks horrid. Another point of contention worth mentioning here as well, just before I end this segment, is the way that they rationalize this, is that they cite just a made-up statistic. They cite a made-up statistic with no real backing for it. Let me show you what I mean. So the talking point that these Israeli propagandists like to use is that 90% of war victims are civilians. 90% of the dead are usually civilians. So Israel is actually doing really good in Gaza. which obviously isn't true. If you look at the demographics for literally any conflict ever, the vast majority of dead are combatants. If the vast majority of dead are not combatants, it's always a genocide. Always a genocide. So as I cited in my previous video on the way that people deny the Gaza death toll, this 1 in 9 figure that these Zionists like to use comes from a misreading of a report that claimed, based on zero evidence in the first place, that 9 out of 10 victims of war and armed conflict today are civilians, which meant that anyone affected by war in any way, not just dead, anyone who had to leave their house, who suffered any property damage, who was injured in any way, who suffered any inconvenience, that's what they meant by that. Not dead. Not dead. And people took this figure and reinterpreted it to mean 9 in 10 war dead are civilians, which isn't true. Not even close. It's closer to 3 in 4 war dead are combatants. And if they're not, something is very wrong. Another thing that I want to point out, as I did in my video that I made on the topic, because this is still applicable even today, is that even if you assume that literally every single man in Gaza above the age of 18 is a member of the Hamas Al-Qassam brigades, if you say every single man in Gaza, every single non-elderly man below the age of 60 is a combatant, which obviously they're not, then the civilian death ratio in Gaza would still be higher by a lot than that in Syria and Bosnia. Think about the implications of that reality. These people will never respond to me. I've sent emails to this Eisenberg guy and others like him, asking them, come on my stream and let's talk about this. When I refute him, he just blocks me without replying, obviously. Because these people, they know they're lying. They know what they're saying can't hold up. They rely on you being ignorant. So we need to spread the sort of thing that I'm saying here so they can't do that anymore.